Welcome. This is Helpful Principles in Adversarial Operations. This is a presentation that I gave at the Adversarial Village of Defcon 30, and I am now re-recording it the week later for the internet. So, what are we going to talk about today? We're going to start with a little bit about me, how I got here. We're also going to talk about why principles in general, where did these come from, how have I produced these, and then finally we're going to cover the actual principles of adversarial kind of conflict for cyber conflict. Specifically, we're going to look at 7 different principles, which we will also go over. So just a little bit of background. I've been basically in InfoSec for the last 15 years. I write a blog at lockbox.org. I've also been doing at least the last 8 years consecutively of attack and defense competitions. These will cover what these mean, but these are things like pros versus Joes, CCDC, and then a number of attack and defense, more traditional CTFs. About last year, I wrote a best-selling book on InfoSec, specifically these principles and kind of adversarial cybersecurity. And right now I'm an incident response lead. So some disclaimers, this is a heavy theory talk. We're pretty much going to cover theory exclusively here. Some of these principles are pretty simple. These are not like complex things. They're simple observations that can be leveraged when you are actually a hands-on keyboard with another hacker. There are exceptions to all these. These are not laws. These are just best practices that I have found have given me an advantage in a conflict. And there are tons of other principles. These are just some that I have cherry-picked as being exceptionally helpful. Some sources of where these principles come from. I pull a lot of these from Barton Whaley's Towards a General Theory of Deception. I also pull a lot of these from Matthew Monet's Networks, Attacks, and Exploitation. You'll see a lot of references to Sun Tzu's The Art of War. However, this is not like, we're not just throwing Sun Tzu quotes in there. We're applying Sun Tzu's quotes and Sun Tzu's Art of War directly to cybersecurity, which is where I think a lot of times you don't see it actually applied. Still great theories, great lessons, but we're operating in a different domain now. So you have to really apply those lessons to the domain. And then a lot of these just come from my own personal experience, and then I've adapted them into larger theories. So just a little bit about attack and defense competitions. Here on the left, we can see a picture of pros versus Joes at B-Sides LV. These are basically real-time competitions where you have the attacker and the defender both in the network together, and then they're trying to take control of the computer network to either score points or keep services up for points on the defense. Just a note, these are different than things like the Defcon CTF, where it's a lot of memory corruption based. Most of these competitions focus on a network or systems level, and it's more incident response and red team. Whereas a Defcon attack and defense competition, it's like you get a single VM that runs many services, and that's more memory corruption based and more like binary patching. So we're talking the former, which is more network level, systems level, red team, pen testing, and incident response type skills. And then just a note, in these competitions, offense and defense are very distinct sides. They have different tools, different techniques, and really different playbooks to accomplish their goals, which means like it is explicit expertise. So you need people with offensive expertise in Windows or Linux, and you need people with targeted expertise to do the job that you want to do on your team, which is a lot of the times defend and then attack. So on my teams, I like to actually weight it heavier in defense. So if I have 10 team members on a pros versus Joes team, I will have 8 of them skilled around defense and potentially 2 of them skilled around offense. So what are the principles we will cover today? We're going to cover the principle of deception, the principle of physical access, the principle of humanity, the principle of economy, the principle of planning, the principle of innovation, and the principle of time. We're going to go over each of these in depth, starting with the principle of deception. So the principle of deception simply states that the use of deception or obfuscation or showing fake data will help us get an advantage over an opponent in a cyber conflict. Sun Tzu says all warfare is based on deception, but what does this mean? Very specifically, in computer security, both sides cannot let the other side know of their plans. If we were to get into a conflict and the defense just had all of their detections published openly, it would be very easy for the offense to circumvent these. Likewise, if the defense knew the exact tools the offense was bringing to the table, then it would be very easy for them to block or bypass. So both sides rely on the other side not knowing their specific tools, techniques, or signatures, or else they would be trivial to deal with. And deception and timing, we can leverage those to both surprise and catch an opponent off guard in this conflict. So we need to define deception a little bit better. In this book, Military Deception, or this paper really, they boil it down to deception being hiding the real and showing the fake. And just a note too, when we go to apply deception, we can't just apply it wherever we want. Robert Clark, from his book Deception, says one does not conduct deception for the sake of deception itself. It supports an overarching plan or objective. So you don't just go and add deception everywhere. You add deception in very targeted places to support your end goal. And we'll see why, because there's a real cost associated with this. So what does deception look like when applied to cybersecurity? We can see a lot of examples, but like, for example, hiding the real looks like malware obfuscation. You are now obfuscating your code. People can't really tell just by looking at the code any longer what it does. They have to kind of work this back, and it takes a lot of analyst time that is good for the attacker, lets them dig in deeper, hide more, or just creates ambiguity for the defender where they don't know if this is good or bad. Likewise, here we see the defender showing the fake. They're using a tool called artillery to show all of the ports open when they get port scanned. This is very interesting because as an attacker, you usually get the exact opposite. You get a very small condensed list of available ports. Here, they're showing the attacker all ports. So it's going to completely change the attacker's normal analysis. They're not going to know what to do. Do they now have to like further enumerate each of these ports to find out what the real services are? It creates just a roadblock for them, and it's going to change their plans completely. I also like to include these lists from the CIA's do's and don'ts with their tradecraft. This was disclosed material, so if you have a clearance, you should probably stop watching now. But the CIA's do's and don'ts say, do obfuscate or encrypt all strings or configuration data in the tool. Essentially, also do not decrypt or deobfuscate immediately. Only do this when you're using it in memory. So that means don't like run a routine at the beginning of the malware that just unpacks the malware and then drops that plain text to disk. You only want to deobfuscate this stuff as you need it, and then you want to do good garbage collection to remove it and make sure you're not leaving this stuff in memory. And then they also suggest stripping all symbols, any identifying information from the binary. Again, this is hiding the real. This is removing any of those strings that could reveal what this thing is actually doing. So next, we're going to move on to the principle of physical access. This states that a physical control of a device grants a superior level of control or access to the machine, where you can pull the plug from the internet, forensically analyze it, or just re-image the machine altogether. Here, I drew up a little graphic, but oftentimes as an attacker, we will come in here at a root level on the machine. And it stinks because the defender is often already below us. They might have an EDR agent or something that was already installed operating at the kernel level, which gives them innate access and insight into the things we want to do. Sometimes as the attacker, you can come in at the kernel level. However, the defender will probably have been there already. So they also, again, have that innate control over you, likely. However, sometimes as the attacker, you can come in at the hypervisor level. This is, let's say you compromise an ESXi host, or you compromise the vCenter console itself. Or let's say you compromise an AWS management console with some keys. Coming in at this hypervisor level gives you then that ability to re-provision machines, turn stuff off, edit any of those, almost like physical access controls. So it becomes very powerful, especially if you're here and the defender doesn't know you're down here and you're operating there surreptitiously. It can be extremely powerful. However, in almost all cases, the defender still has physical access to the machines. which means once they discover that you're at any of these levels, they can simply go through and re-provision machines, pull the internet access, perform dead disk forensics, and really find out where the attacker is and remove their ability to access the machines. However, we do have one very powerful tool here, which is cryptography. Cryptography can protect the integrity and confidentiality of data when it's in a hostile computing environment. So what does that mean? It means, like, let's say I put malware or I'm trying to exfiltrate data off this machine. I can encrypt that data. And even though the defender has root access, they can't access the data that I've encrypted. What it doesn't mean is that I can't completely take over a machine with cryptography, because it doesn't prevent access to those computing resources. So I can encrypt all the data I'm trying to steal. If they don't care about that data or they have backups of that data, they can simply re-image the machine. I lose all my access. One thing that people, I think about here a lot is ransomware. Ransomware only really works because it's extortion. If they were to have a backup of the data or another copy of the data that you're preventing them from seeing, which you're preventing, you're ransoming the confidentiality of this data, you're extorting it. If they were to have other copies of that data, this would be totally useless. They would just reformat the machines and kick the attacker out and say, we're done with this attacker. We don't care that they've encrypted our data. So this means that the offense can really never overtly dominate a network. Even in the case of ransomware, it's always time-based access. Like, they're only holding this data for ransom for a certain period of time. They're never like dominating the entire network for months on end. It's very easy usually to remove ransomware attackers. Therefore, offense's natural path is stealth. Offense is going to get their best results while they are surreptitiously moving through the network, as long as they are not overt. Again, the ransomware being the exception, it's more of a smash and grab. It's more of an extortion thing than them owning the network. So the corollary here is that the physical access is then often trumps digital access, or that physical security should come first over digital security, as local and physical attacks in a targeted environment or a hostile environment can yield more access, more control than digital attacks often. From the CIA's do's and don'ts, they say, do encrypt all data written to disk. Be very mindful of whatever you're writing to disk, because that is leaving a very physical trace. And they also say, utilize secure erase when removing a file. I can tell you firsthand that we've had, on the CCDC Red team, we've had unencrypted scripts written to disk. We've RM'd them by accident, not SRM or secure remove, and they've been recovered. And it is a boon of intelligence to the defenders to now have a clear text script of all of our post-exploitation activities. So obfuscate if it's going down, SRM it, encrypt if it's getting written to disk. These are the basics. The next principle we're going to cover is the principle of humanity. This states that all computers are fundamentally tools for humans, which means they will have human interfaces, ways for humans to get to them and use this data, and they will include human mistakes. This principle is actually combined from two principles from Matthew Monet's book, Network Attacks and Exploitation. I combine his principle of access, which states because data or systems must be accessed by humans, there's always a viable path to the target data. This means on a red team, if we want to get to a certain database or something, if there's a database administrator, we know that there's a human that works on this and there's a way for them to access it. And then the principle of humanity, which states that C&E is grounded in human nature. So therefore, the attacker or the defender is a person or group of people, which means they have a hierarchy, they have an organization, they probably have bosses, people they report to. And when we combine both of those together, it shows us that we can always find a path to our data, and there's a human team and likely human operators that use this data in some way that we can now target those people and then access this data through their normal access. It also means that the software and these controls on both sides will have ample mistakes. People make mistakes, defenders and attackers, and we can exploit that and abuse that to get an advantage over this other team. We see from the CIA's do's and don'ts that you should not perform any operations on a machine that will cause it to go unresponsive. Humans are great at detecting errors, and if you do anything that makes their computing environment seem off, it is a good way to get detected, is flagged by a human. We'll also see not to put dirty word lists in our binaries. I've seen some defenders, Steve Millertime on Twitter has a great set of Yara rules where he'll search virus total for naughty words, and hackers just put these in all their tools. They're human people, and they include these words, which is then a tell and shows that, this is strange computing. So next we have the principle of economy. The principle of economy states that both the offensive and defensive teams have limited budgets and can only invest in so many strategies. When we say economy, we're not just talking money and budgets in that sense. We're talking budgets in the terms of time, expertise, yes, resources, and money. So this also comes from Matthew Monet's book, Network Attacks and Exploitation. And he very simply says, your ambitions will always exceed your available resources. You will always want to do more than you can. On the CCDC red team, we feel this pain. It's very tangible for us. So most CCDC red teams only consist of 2 or 3 hands-on keyboard attackers, whereas a CCDC blue team, the defenders, will be 8 people. These people in the light blue shirts, minus this guy as a coach. So they'll have 8 team members against our 3, which means we can't play one-on-one. We can't waste time as a red teamer being on the same machine as a blue teamer, as they'll be able to absorb our resources and still be able to respond to other stuff. So on our team, our strategy can never be get bogged down with another person. We need to pivot, persist, and disrupt as much as possible, constantly going to other machines that they may not have been on yet to give us that advantage versus get caught into a one-on-one with them and waste our time and attention as an attacker. This means you also will likely need to automate many things that you don't have the manpower to get or support. So buy or build often becomes a strategy in these types of competitions. You might not have talent for a reverse engineer, but you might want those capabilities. So making sure you get like dynamic sandboxes or RE services can save you valuable team and headcount. And then you also want to prioritize roles. You want to understand like what is your core skill set, how many of those people do you have available, and then where can you really position them for the biggest bang for your buck, and then how can you augment them to help them, either service more machines or help other people, like maybe a ticket queue or some kind of application they can work. In competitions, we automate a ton of stuff. We'll see this later in the principle of planning, but basically we're going to use these large downtimes and these planning cycles to automate the stuff that we don't have the headcount or expertise to support. So the principle of planning simply states that writing down or automating these plans will provide an advantage when dealing with the complexity of computers in a high stress situation. And here we can see Peter Kim's The Hacker Playbook. This is an awesome book. 3 different editions. Each edition is almost completely different. And it just goes over basic pen testing playbooks, showing people how to do these exact operations. And when I do planning, I always start at playbooks. I just very simply show people, this is how you execute this technique. Here are some resources. Here's some common pitfalls or places you might get stuck. And it's just there to help somebody else that may be less familiar with that technique execute it, under the gun when they're in a stressful competition. Here we can also see Joe Vest's Red Team Development and Operations. This is a great book too. Basically, the principle of planning says plan for the hard stuff while it's easy. While you have this downtime, try to set a lot of this up. And Joe Vest's book really does that. He says, like, every red team you're going in, you're going to need deployment, you're going to need setup, you're going to have to get your tools ready. And at the end of it, you're going to have to write a report. It's going to be very similar, a lot of these steps. So his book talks about creating processes and tools to standardize this stuff so that you can easily deploy new attacking instances for people so they don't have to spend time doing this during the operations. So again, Sun Tzu says, plan for what is difficult while it's easy, do what is great while it is small. There's an entire chapter in The Art of War on planning. It's the very first chapter. Basically says if you don't plan, this is another famous quote, but If you fail to plan, then you plan to fail, right? Like you on the CCDC red team, for example, we know what we're going to do in the first 10 minutes. Like we've done it so many times that we have a game plan and we know exactly what we're going to do. And we can apply this quote directly, right? Plan for what is difficult while it is easy. We also have a 3 to 6 month lead time before the competition where we can meet with our people, we can plan, we can say, hey, in that first minute, we want to scan for these known vulnerabilities, and we can spend time writing those tools in those months prior to make that faster and more effective. And we can test months prior before the actual competition. So this leads to a great story. The B-17s or flying fortresses were released in World War II. And these things were just falling out of the sky for a long time until they introduced a pre-flight checklist. Once they introduced the pre-flight checklist, they removed a lot of the complexity of these new planes and the pilots stopped crashing. And that completely changed the history of flying altogether. We now do pre-flight checklists before every commercial flight. It's a massive innovation that's saved millions of lives, or not millions, but saved dozens of lives. So the takeaway here, I think, is that typically smart, skilled people, pilots, doctors, hackers, feel like they don't need run books, they don't need checklists. They think these things get in their way. And while you're largely right, what these checklists also do is set baseline and ensure repeatability, and it ensures a quality consistency across the operation. So as much as they do get in our way and they do feel like a burden, they serve a very valuable purpose to baseline and make sure everybody kind of does stuff in a repeatable, similar way. And I think they're very valuable for that reason. So finally, like planning, everybody in cybersecurity kind of does this, whether you do it unconsciously or you do it consciously. If you have an IR plan, you have a plan. If you have a pen test methodology, you have a plan. If there's threat modeling you've done at an org, you've planned. So what I'm saying is I think a lot of people do planning perhaps unconsciously, and you should just do it consciously. You should sit down and really think, what are we going to do when this happens? So like I was saying in the competition, we plan out the first 10 minutes, we plan out the first hour, we plan out the first half day. We have a strategy for our first day, we have a strategy for the second day. And having all these different plans creates milestones where we can then check in with the team and we can say, hey, 10 minutes in, do you have credentials? Have you gotten access? Have you dropped hashes yet? And are we cracking those? And if not, then we know where we should be and where we are, and hopefully how we can adjust the plans to get where we want to be. So not only is planning important to make sure your whole team's on the same page, they're all doing the same thing, but it's important as a leader to now have these milestones to gauge your progress and understand how well are you actually doing. Like, are you hitting your plan? And then we have the Mike Tyson quote, everybody has a plan until you get punched in your mouth. Well, I don't go into a fight not expecting to get punched, right? And that's what I'm doing here is I'm going into fights. So I know my plan is going to go wrong. I know at a certain point I'm going to have a smart opponent and they're going to counter my plan. So what I do is I create multiple contingency plans. When you're doing that original planning set, you're going to ideate a lot. You're going to create all these different ideas and these different plans. And you can take those plans that you don't choose and make those a B plan, a C plan, and have these contingency plans so that if something does go critically wrong, you can change your strategy mid-game and pivot and continue to be effective. I do this all the time, especially in competitions. I'll have a plan A, use this set of A credentials, get in there, drop persistence, loot the local database. And if that doesn't work, let's say your A creds fail, I'll give them B creds and I'll have these backup credentials. And I'll say, you inform the group, let everybody know your A creds didn't work and you're going to plan B. And you're still going to get in there, drop the database and persist. And if that doesn't work, we'll have a C plan and we'll say, all right, forget the creds. I need you just to go right to the web app, drop the database, and kind of get these points because we know things are going south fast and we need to pivot quickly. So I think having those contingency plans and knowing when having milestones that say, wow, this is not going right, what do we do, is very important to still being successful in like the event that things are going bad. So from the CIA's do's and don'ts, I really like this, but they basically have an uninstall or remove instructions for your implants. And this is incredible because you know your implants so well inside and out that you can remove any processes, any registry keys, any services, any files they drop. You'll be able to take all of this out and fix your implant. This is also just important because inevitably when you're writing malware, you execute it somewhere where you probably didn't want to execute it. And it's just nice to have this functionality, or an uninstall tool if you don't want to bundle it into the same implant that does do the persistence, because you don't want somebody to manipulate that on the other side. But having it documented, having the ability to remove it, or a second tool can be very powerful. Likewise, understanding that full forensic footprint, what exactly will your tool do on the other system, is amazing for understanding how can people detect your tool, how can they catch you. And it's almost like doing a little purple teaming on your own, right? Like look at it from a systems perspective. What is my binary now doing when I put it on that machine? What are the physical traces? And kind of getting that other perspective can be really helpful for an attacker. Next principle we're going to cover is the principle of innovation. This simply states that the high level of complexity within computing makes it very easy to innovate. So first, what is innovation? What are we saying when we're saying innovation? Basically, innovation is anything that makes a process easier, simplifies it, combines processes, produces new capabilities, exploits a feature. Any of these things where you're adding to or removing existing features is innovation, in my opinion. And this can change the tempo of conflict. This can radically alter how these computer programs interface with each other, how users interact with the computers. So I think programming or scripting or just modifying tools and processes can be very, very powerful in the sense of computer conflict. So again, I think new tool dev in this space is very easy, and it doesn't all have to be at once. You can constantly innovate and improve on your plans. You can also just have plans like runbooks and then slowly automate those into tools. And that's a very easy innovation you can do. Here you can see we developed a dropper piece of Windows malware for the CCDC season. And this went through so many innovations. This originally started as a batch script that I wrote, and then we rewrote it in auto IT and started embedding objects in it. And then PowerShell became really hot, and we rewrote it all in PowerShell. Then they came out with PowerShell script block logging, and I was like, I got to get off of PowerShell. So we translated the whole thing into a Golang mono repo. This became really cool, but we wanted to like start including even more things in it. So we had like a share where people could drop it in, and then it would like auto bundle all these. We thought this was great. We wanted to take it to the next level. So we wrote a framework to do this. And then eventually we're like, well, people need to add to our framework. So we ended up writing a JavaScript JavaScript freaking interpreter into our engine. So that way you could program Go in JavaScript and it would cross compile or compile these into Golang binaries. So innovation over years where we kept changing our tool, we added new functionality, we wanted other people to add to it, so we simplified things. And all of that is innovation, and all of that changed the way we operated and changed the way our defenders would respond to us. So key, I think, tool development that we did in the off time, which then had a tremendous impact on our actual execution in game. Finally, like deception, we shouldn't just innovate for innovation's sake. The quote goes, necessity is the mother of all invention, and it's very important to innovate the right things rather than just arbitrary innovation. I think one amazing example of innovation within the CCDC competition was the University of Virginia, or UVA, created this tool called Blue Swan, which was an EDR light that they could use to triage and harden machines mid-competition. This is great because you don't always have that deep Windows expertise on every machine you go to. So they automated that. They created these tools, and now everybody had that expertise of that Windows hardening expert on whatever Windows box they were on. So it can be very effective for sharing skills or like leveling up the team by writing tools and then distributing them around the group. And then here's another great innovation story. At CPTC, which is the Collegiate Penetration Testing Competition, competition where we build a mock environment, invite students to come in and run penetration tests on it to get access. At CPTC, we hold regional events where we introduce them to a beta environment, and then we hold our finals events where we invite all the students to come back in for a network penetration retest and to retest like our expanded network scope with new assets. So in between one of the regional events and the final event, this student team found unauthenticated SQL injection in an open trade application that we were using in the environment. This gave them unauthenticated access to the database. This is a massive innovation because where they previously didn't even have access to this application, they now have full database access. Not only did this allow them to win first place in the competition by giving them access that no other team had, but they also found a real world ode day, and they were able to find and patch real world vulnerabilities. So not only was it great innovation for the competition, allowed them to win, but it had real world implications, and innovating isn't always as straightforward as you might think. There might be many tangential benefits. And this trend has continued. Almost every year now, we see teams finding O days or trying to innovate and really just change the entire aspect of the game by getting vulns and access we never even imagined when we put the competition together. From the CIA do's and don'ts list, they say do use end-to-end encryption for all network communications. Never use networking protocols which break this, which is very interesting. Like they're essentially saying implement your own encryption under things like TLS or similar technologies, and implement your own end-to-end encryption so that people can't just decrypt it, which is really cool. I think that type of innovation where you're implementing your own applications of protocols is neat. Like yet another tool is really nice to see because it changes the dynamics, and it's just a one-off that makes it harder to reverse. Likewise, don't hard code file names, file paths, times, dates, things like that. You want your malware to be as dynamic as possible. Which brings us to our last principle, which is the principle of time. And it simply states that timing is critical in regards to computer conflicts, and there's many ways to take advantage of this, such as automation or bit rot. So surprise, I believe, is the timing of an attack plus the application of deception. And by inducing surprise, you can catch your opponent off guard, which gives you a massive tactical advantage. Basically, anytime you can surprise your opponent in a combat, you then have the ability to take advantage of their assumptions. So in terms of computer conflict, this could be like attacking when they least expect it, such as on Christmas or a Friday night after everybody's gone home. They'll be short-staffed. It's definitely not when they were expecting their incident to happen. And then Sun Tzu says, quickness is the essence of war. So what we can gain from this is that by automating our techniques, we will get higher execution speed than somebody who had to like sit there and manually type commands out. So if we have commands that'll kick another attacker off the box, we know if we automate these into tools and we were actually to land hands-on keyboard with another attacker or hacker on the same machine, we could win that conflict because we know our tools will execute quicker than they ever could. I automated a bunch of this kind of stuff in my book. For example, I have scripts that will, if you're SSH to a machine, will automatically put that machine into quarantine using IP tables rules so that only your IP address can now interface with that machine. Super powerful if you find another hacker hands-on keyboards on your machine and you want to take over the machine before they can. Timelining an attack as a defender can be an incredibly revealing technique because it'll tell a story where you see all of these detections matched on a greater timeline. So you could see how the attacker may have pivoted or deployed new malware or like what their timeline was. This is also helpful in understanding either their movement around the network or they're just the rhythm of the attacker. When do they log on for the day? When do they log off? What is their normal operating day? And those kinds of things to understand can be very helpful in both attributing and preparing for an attacker. And then I've included this. This is from my book. I call it the defender's fallacy, or what happens when the defender responds too soon. And very simply, we have the attacker land on an original host. The attacker immediately laterally moves to a new host. At this point, the defender has an alert, and they respond and remediate the first system without realizing the attacker spread. At this point, it becomes very easy for the attacker now to change their techniques, which makes it much harder for the defender to track them down, to get them out of the network, and can make evicting the attacker very difficult. We also have a phenomenon in computer security called bit rot, and this actually comes from Moore's law, where the speed of computing doubles every year or so. They say it doubles, which then affects cryptography, where you have computational security, and then old keys can be brute forced. But essentially, bit rot is as you find older systems in a computing environment, they will be weaker and they will have inherent flaws in them. This is a very real phenomenon. And you can even see it with pen testers as they network scan. They can find older systems or older applications, and they just naturally move there because they know that there are going to be vulnerabilities in these older systems. From the CIA's do's and don't list, we can see you want to remove sensitive memory from memory, or sensitive data from memory, as soon as possible. You don't want to leave configurations in memory, as that will cause tells that the defender can dump memory and find things you were doing. You also want to consider deployment time unique keys, such as keying to the domain, or something I do on my malware is I have execution dates where my malware won't execute after a certain date because I know it's malicious software and I'm using it for a very targeted op, so I don't need it to execute beyond those dates. They also talk about variable size and timing in your beacons. If you've ever done network analysis with Wireshark and you've seen malware that doesn't have jitter, it creates a very rhythmic pattern that just jumps right out to an analyst as being kind of machine generated or not natural. Finally, as a defender, please use GMT for your timestamps. It makes things much easier. So some takeaways. We covered 7 principles that can hopefully help you regardless of what part of the conflict you're in. The principle of deception. The use of deception will get an advantage over an opponent in a computer conflict. Principle of physical access, where having physical access to a device grants a superior level of control. Principle of humanity. Computers are fundamentally tools for humans, and we can abuse that. Principle of economy. Both sides have limited budgets that can be both abused, and you should be aware of it. The principle of planning, which is writing down or automating plans, again, will give us an advantage in highly stressful, highly complex situations. The principle of innovation, which states that it is very easy to innovate in highly complex environments, such as computing. And lastly, the principle of time, which is timing is critical in regards to computer conflict. If I can give you a big takeaway for the principle of time, it's don't instantly react to things, but hold your reaction for the right time. That becomes extremely powerful, where you now hold your reaction, and the timing of your reaction has much greater impact than just knee-jerk reacting to events. So some Q&As. If people have questions, you can find me on Twitter. I'm at Injection. I also wrote a book, Cybersecurity Tradecraft, Offense versus Defense in Real Time. I urge you to check it out. And lastly, we're hiring at scale, both on the incident response team, and we're looking for a senior to lead our infrastructure security program. So if you find any of this interesting, please reach out. Please talk to me. Thank you very much. Have a good day.